But the story jumps forward in time and takes us to a family living in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. It's a place, an ancient city located in Mesopotamia, so around the Euphrates. And there's a man there called Abram. Abram. And he's there with his dad and his extended family. And they move out of Ur and they migrate to a place called Haran. And there they settle. They've moved up the river, up towards the north, moving into, I guess, sort of the top of Iraq, the sort of Kurdistan area, into modern day Syria, that kind of area. And then whilst they're there, having already left their home city, Abram gets a message from God. God speaks to him and says, leave your home and also leave your family. And go to the place I'm going to show you. There's a bit of faith, there's a bit of uncertainty there, a place that God is going to show, God is going to reveal to him, and he's going to have to set off before he knows what that place is. So he sets off. And he takes his wife, Sarah, and he also takes other members of the household, servants, stewards, that kind of thing, and he takes his nephew, Lot. But God doesn't send him completely in the dark into the unknown, because God gives Abram some promises. He tells Abram that he will bless him. He's going to give him this land that he's going to show him. He's going to bless him with many descendants. And he's going to make a great nation, even nations out of Abram. And in him, there's going to be blessing. Those that bless him and his descendants will be blessed. Those that curse him and oppose him and his descendants, they will be cursed, opposed by God. So here we've got this promise, and you will realise now, having been listening for a bit, that we are seeing those big three themes coming up. God's protection and provision, the God who blesses Abram and his descendants, chosen as God's people. And the land that Abram is going to be shown, which of course is Canaan, this promised land, God's place where God's people will dwell in God's presence. Abram reaches the land, and what he does is he keeps sort of crossing the land, I guess sort of marking out, getting the lie of the land. And what he does at different places is he builds altars to worship God, to acknowledge God's provision, to mark this out as God's place, to mark out the boundaries. There are boundaries again. To keep, to guard this land, and to guard it by worshipping the one true and living God. And by building these altars, we might also say that Abram represents God there, the true and living God in a land of idolatry, so that he is God's image bearer there. And Abraham is there to fill the land with his descendants and to subdue it, to rule it. Though, of course, at this stage, he is living as a sojourner. He's living as a guest in a land that already has a population. And that population, as it happens, are the descendants of Canaan. Remember Canaan, Ham's son? The one who had the curse on him because of his father causing shame and harm to Noah. Yeah, those Canaanites. You're meant to pick up on that. And once in the land, Abraham starts to face challenges. Immediate challenge number one, a famine comes. There's drought and famine. And in fact, Abraham very quickly leaves the land and he goes down to Egypt and he gets into an absolute mess there because he pretends that Sarah, his Sarai at that time, is not his wife but his sister, because he's afraid that he will be put to death so that his wife can be taken from him. And this leads to trouble because Pharaoh sets eyes on her and takes her into his harem. And that brings God's judgment, God's curses. And so Abraham is found out. Well, even though Abraham gets it wrong, God in his grace still chooses to bless him through that. Lots of stuff to discuss and debate about what's going on there. They return to the land. There are more challenges. The land, the bit of the land where they're in, becomes too crowded between Lot's people and Abraham's people. They start to get into squabbles about land and space for farming and nurturing and providing for their flocks. So they agree to go their different ways. Lot is given first choice and he chooses the most fertile bit of the land. He heads down to the valley, and Abraham is left with the more barren kind of uplands. And that doesn't look great at that stage. There still seems to be a threat to the promise of land and blessing and provision. Lot heading to the plains, to the fertile valleys, will lead him into all sorts of trouble. We're not going to get into the details of that story at the moment, but read it. There's lots to learn from that. Lots. See what I did there. But I want us to keep following Abraham's story to see again the challenge that challenge around God's blessing and provision, that challenge around the land itself. But also there's a challenge around the question of people, of descendants, because the land had been barren when Abraham and Sarah, their names change a bit, we'll come on to that a bit later. They arrive in a land that quickly appears barren, and that echoes their own experience because they are barren, infertile, unable to have children. And the years go by and there's no sign of children. How is God's promise going to be kept? And one of the themes through this bit of Genesis 12 onwards, is all to do with how can that promise be kept, and the different ways that Abraham attempts to force the issue and resolve it by himself, just like we so often do. So, one thing that happens is that God speaks to Abraham again and says, "You are going to have a son," and Abraham struggles to believe that. And he says, "When I die, all my possessions will go to one of the servants in my household." And God says, "No, you are going to have a son." So they try something. Sarai has a servant, a slave girl called Hagar, and she brings him to Lot as a concubine, as someone to stand in for her. And she has a son called Ishmael. But God again is very clear that's not the answer. And he says, he meets with Abram and again and says, "You will have a son." And his wife just can't believe this. Sarai laughs. And God says, the son will be called Isaac. That name has the idea of laughter in it. You don't need to laugh at this. As unbelievable as it sounds, God is going to keep his promises. And so, eventually, this son, Isaac, is born. But pause there. Do you see how God is making it clear that all of the expectations I might have, he does not need to try and sort things out himself, and those solutions are not the solution. He might have thought that Lot would be his heir. Lot's own father had died. He's brought him with him, expecting him perhaps to be the one who succeeded. But Lot has gone his own way, got into his own mess. Will it be Eliezer, this servant, this steward in the household? No, it's not going to be him. Will it be Ishmael? At least a physical descendant of Abraham? No. And the New Testament will distinguish and say that it's not about this physical descent and the firstborn in that kind of way, but it's about the one who is the true child of the promise. Well, just to add in something else at this stage. God repeatedly meets with Abraham and keeps renewing his promise. He makes a covenant with Abraham, and there are different signs and symbols there. One of the symbols that is introduced is this thing called circumcision, the removal of his foreskin and that of his descendants. Another thing that God does is he changes Abraham's name. The name means a father, the father of a people. But he changes it to Abraham or Abraham, depending on your pronunciation, which has more the sense of the father of many nations, a multitude of peoples, just to really emphasize the abundant, inexhaustible bounty that is in his blessing, his provision, and his promises. That's what God is like. Another challenge will come, just when all seems to be settled. Because God will come to Abraham and say, take your son, your only son, your son whom you love. It's fascinating language, isn't it? With its echoes into the New Testament and into John's Gospel. Think typology here. Isaac becoming a type of Christ. Take your son again to a place I'm going to show you and offer him there as a sacrifice. There's another thing there is this story, despite all of these sort of apparent dawns of hope, is it actually going to end in tragedy in the end? Does God turn out to have been tricking and deceiving Abraham? Is there going to be a cruel twist at the end. Does God take back everything that he has given? But Abraham trusts, he believes in God. And he takes his son to a mountain, Mount Moriah, and he prepares the sacrifice, and it's going to be Isaac. And just as he's about to plunge his knife into his son, God speaks and tells him to stop. And God provides a ram. It's caught in a bush, a substitute sacrifice that takes Isaac's place. Abraham is picked up on consistently in the New Testament. We've talked about how Isaac is a type of Christ, but there's lots that we hear about how Abraham, as the father, the ancestor of God's people, and so there's comparisons between Hagar and Sarah in Galatians. Romans 4 most famously takes us to Abraham and says, actually takes a quote from Genesis and reminds us that Abraham believed in, had faith in God, and God credited it to him as righteousness, so that God justifies by faith, not by works. So there's all sorts of fascinating stuff to see in the New Testament. The book of Hebrews will pick up on some of the characters and stories of Abraham's life as well, and we need to understand his story and some of the people in that story to get a sense of a lot of what the New Testament talks about. Well, thanks for watching in again. We'll pick up soon, and we're going to take the story on. We're still in the book of Genesis. This story is still in the, it's not even really out of the foothills yet of our ascent into the Bible story, but all of this foundational stuff is so important to understanding what will come later. We'll probably speed up at some point. Next time we're going to find out a bit more about Abraham's immediate descendants, those known as the patriarchs. So we are thinking about Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's descendants. Thank you for watching it.